question 99 of the Secunda. The topic for this lecture is sacrilege, and I am Dr. Thibault. So, placing sacrilege, where does it go? We have the cardinal virtue of justice. Under the cardinal virtue of justice, we have the heart of justice, which is religion, which is a virtue in and of itself. It's a moral virtue. As a moral virtue, it means it is properly sought in its means. Therefore, there is an excess, which is superstition, and there is also deficiency, which is irreligious. When we look at irreligious activity, we have irreligious by word, which we've already covered by temptation of God and perjury, and then irreligious in deed, and that is where we find ourselves today in the topic of sacrilege, one of the two irreligious activities by deed. Now, sacrilege, a thing is called sacred. Well, to know what a sacrilege is, first you have to know sacred. Sacred is called through being used for divine worship. So something is sacred when it has divine use, it has a utility, which is have a divine purpose. Now, irreverence then is an insult towards that sacred thing, and irreverence to the sacred thing, which becomes an insult to God. Therefore, it becomes a sacrilege. A sacrilege is a special sin in Article 2 because it is directly opposed to a special virtue. So sacrilege finds a special aspect of deformity, namely the violation of sacred things by treating it irreverently. So religion is a special virtue because it aims at giving God God's due. So since it's aimed a virtue aimed directly at God, it is a special virtue. So sacrilege going against religion makes it a special sin. Now you can also have sacrilege from against divine things irreverently, but also you can do it by perverting the divine law. That is also a sacrilege. So the law as a thing can be violated. Also, sacrilege can exist without other sins. This is in response to objection 3. So if a judge were to order a person who is claiming sanctuary in a church to be pulled out of the church, be put on trial, when they could have pulled them out at another time, that would be a sacrilege. It's not that the judge doesn't have the right to pull somebody, detain somebody on behalf of the common good, but let's say the person is at mass at a holy hour, you could wait until they leave. You don't have to detain the person during the mass or during the holy hour. If the person is hiding there, that's sanctuary, that's a different thing, but it would be sacrilegious to interrupt the mass to detain somebody for a temporal matter when you could simply wait. Now, there's special species to sacrilege. Again, sacrilege violates the idea that reverence is due to sacred things by reason of holiness. So the holier the object, the more grievous the sacrilege. That's fairly obvious. This includes sacred ministers, holy places, vessels, vestments, images, relics. This is fairly straightforward. If you were to sacrilegious to St. Cecilia's Church in Pawtucket, that would be bad. To be irreverent towards the tomb of the Holy Sepulchre would be worse, right? Because of the relationship between that church and the suffering, death, and resurrection of Christ is different. Not that either one is good, but there is degrees of worse. To do something to a chalice, which holds the blood of Christ is worse than the candlestick, which is used for sacred worship, but not directly to the body and blood of Christ. So everything has to a level of degree. Now, St. Thomas points out that the highest degree of sacrilege is against the Eucharist, since Christ himself is the Eucharist and the means by which man is sanctified. So both in terms of in and of itself, which is Christ, and in terms of how is it sacred in the world, well, it's the primary means of sanctification of human beings. Therefore, it's double, right? It's double sacrilege. Um, Sacrilege is dealing primarily with things, primarily for sacred worship. But Eucharist in itself is not an object, but a person. It's not a what, it's a who. Therefore, it is clearly the highest violation would be against the Eucharist itself, because it's not something directed towards Christ, it is Christ. So obviously that would be the highest form of a sacrilege, which would be against the Eucharist. And St. Thomas points this out. Now, every sin committed by a sacred person is a sacrilege materially and accidentally. St. Thomas points out in response to objection 3. Every says every trifle on the lips of a priest is sacrilege. Right? So when religious people, particularly people who are consecrated to religious life or ordained to holy orders, they are looked at as images of Christ, as images of holiness. Therefore, everything that they do that would be sinful in some ways is a scandal, right? High expectations, but that's what St. Thomas pulls out for people. If you're going to be consecrated, then you have to be even more careful about your activities, because you're not just a regular guy or gal. You're consecrated to Christ, therefore your actions are judged more, much more harshly, because you could scandalize somebody away from the faith by your lack of devotion. Now, the fourth article, now this is an interesting one, punishment of sacrilege. So there's two different steps. One is in terms of equity, right? What is justice aims at equity. So if one were to do something sacrilegious, to violate the reverence of holy things, sacred things, the proper fitting punishment would be a separation of that person from holy things, right? The person has violated holy things, therefore they are now no longer given access to holy things, and that is done by excommunication. Now, excommunication is not a punishment for the sake of punishment. It is a medicine for a disorder. Hopefully, if a person is excommunicated, it causes them to reflect more seriously and to come to repentance, so that they may come back to the sacraments and reverence towards God, which will ultimately end up leading to their own salvation, right? If you would allow a person to continue to commit sacrilege, you're only allowing them to dig the hole deeper. So that's not the ideal. The other step is that if a person is completely hardened against God, and excommunication might not do anything, right? If a person hates God, the person is complete rejection of God. That's why they're committing these acts of irreverence towards God and the sacred objects. Well, excommunication might not mean anything because they didn't want to be communicated in the first place. Well, within Catholic societies, within Christian societies, civil law might have laws of capital punishment, which is any type of punishment dealing with the body. It might not have to be death. It could be other things that deal with the body. In the old days, some form of bodily punishment or penalties. And St. Thomas points out that the church cannot inflict death of the body on anyone. So even in Catholic countries, the church has no control over it. Even with the Inquisition, right? The most brutal Inquisition was the Spanish Inquisition, where the state was running that. Any type of church inquisition was fairly limited with its scope of punishment because the church doesn't want to be in the business of putting people to death, right? It kind of violates natural law and the desire to live, right? Punishment is appropriate, but um, uh, corporal punishment is not in the business of the church, although certain states can do that. And although this might seem very outdated, there was a case only in the last year of a priest down in New Orleans who had lewd and indecent acts of sacrilegion on an altar with women, and the civil law within Louisiana uh, put him in jail. You would say, well, he only had sexual acts between him and two consenting adult women. Um, that's not illegal. Well, it was obscene acts on an altar, right? So it became punishable. Part of it was that it was semi-public, because I guess people who walked by the church could see in it, I guess. But part of it would be just is obscene. So the obscenity part of it, it's kind of tying in here, right? This person might spend a number of years in jail for his sacrilegious, obscene behavior, right? The church could not throw him in jail. They could excommunicate him, but the civil authorities can also do something to punish him and the women involved in that. In conclusion, sacrilege is something the sacrilege is something which is irreverent towards sacred things. Sacrilege is a special sin against a special virtue, which is religion. There are degrees of sacrilege, the highest being irreverence towards the Eucharist, since it's not an object but a person, divine person. Uh, Sacrilege is met with excommunication, and even perhaps civil penalties, depending on the country. Well, this is very short one, but it's very straightforward. So the next time we will cover simony.